Welcome to Woodbury Writes Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with author Richard Seltzer, who lives in Milford, Connecticut, where he writes novels, essays, and comedy full-time. Richard is a Yale graduate who earned a Master's of Arts degree in Comparative Literature from the University of Massachusetts. At Yale, he had creative writing courses with Robert Penn Warren and Joseph Heller. He has written and published 24 books, and they are available on Amazon. His website is seltzerbooks.com. That's SELTZER books.com. For the benefit of our listeners, would you just provide the titles of the books that you've written that are inspired by the epics, the Greek epics?
Yeah, there are three. The first is Breeze, which is short for Briseis. The second is We All Met in Ithaca, or Was It Eden? Those are both in print. The third one is in manuscript now. I hope it will be in print by the fall. And it's entitled Sing Their Wrath, which is a play on the first line of the Iliad. Sing the wrath of Achilles. In this case, the wrath is the wrath of the women.
And you know, I always point out to my students that the women in Homer's works are very, very powerful, and that power can be a subtle presence, and that they are the providers of wisdom and insight and stability, and ultimately the storytellers, because they are the homemakers and the weavers. And if your whole purpose in life is to get home, then the keeper of the home must have some value that's worth thinking about, even if they're not the go-getters of the story. If they're not driving the narrative, that doesn't mean they're not important. Could you just talk about with Sing Their Wrath? And I mean, I've had the privilege of reading your manuscript, and it is so compelling. And I found it does stand quite independently. If I had not have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, I would have felt the impulses driving the story and understood the backstory. Would you just kind of speak to what drove you to tell that story from the women's perspective?
Well, I started, actually, I'd seen a play called Cassandra, and I hated it because she felt like dead, like there was no motivation. Why did she does? It was like a ritual play, a pageant, where there's no real personality or whatever. So I started out trying to write a Cassandra book where, try to put myself. So my first thing that I wrote became the prologue, which was her experiencing being raped by Apollo, or by humans, or by it being both at once, because the god had taken over the body of the humans. But her reaction to that, and his having given her in trade a vision of what the future is, but really confused vision. Okay, so that's where I started. So it was going to be a book about Cassandra. It turned out it shifted as I went along. It filled itself out. Very often when I'm writing, the characters in the course of writing come alive in my imagination. So much of my writing takes place in my sleep. I wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and I'm scribbling madly, and it's like I'm taking dictation. And part of the fun of this is, I don't know where the story's going when I begin, or I think I do, but where it ends up is very different. With regard to the role of women, I jotted down some of the things from that stuck out to me. And strangely, as strange as it was, at the end of the book, Helen invents Greek writing based phonetically on Phoenician alphabet. And after the natural death of her husband, Menelaus, she retires to Arcadia and writes what we now think of as Homer's works. She doesn't share the secret of writing and reading, but she tells her stories to traveling bards who memorize them and perform them all over Greece. Okay, there are other strong women in there that are handled very differently than in the original, but like that notion of wiggle room, they're consistent with what is known. But now, what is it like when you get inside, and what's really going on? we had, okay, not just women, but actually there's a little bit of fluidity. Okay, in the tradition, the goddess Thetis was the mother of Achilles, and she hid him on the island of Skyros, dressing him as a woman and having him live with the women because she didn't want him to go off to war because it was foretold that he'd be killed in the battlefield. Well, when I take that, I have him when he's at Troy. He sometimes enjoys dressing as a woman and putting on drag shows for the entertainment of the troops. Okay. Then there are a variety of other things that are okay. Well, for instance, Clytemnestra is the wife of the commander Agamemnon, and in the plays that were written like 500 years later by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and such, in those plays, Clytemnestra is just a nasty person. Okay. And she's out for revenge on her husband because of the sacrifice of her daughter. Well, in my version, Clytemnestra's lover, Aegisthus, okay, disguised himself as a handmaid, as Clytemnestra's handmaid, and was with her all the time. And yes, and they made love every night. And Agamemnon's children were really his children, and he was just getting revenge because his father and brothers had been killed. Okay, one of my favorite sequences of chapters. I don't know that you. I love the one about his daughter. This one, I dealt with Iphigenia in Breeze. Well, in this one, I call her Iffy, and she's only 3 years old because if you work the stuff back, she had what the Greek playwrights didn't make sense in terms of time. Because Helen is a very young woman at the beginning of the Trojan War, and Clytemnestra is her twin sister. So how the hell would Clytemnestra have a daughter of marriageable age at the beginning of the Trojan War? It made no sense.
Right.
Okay, so I have Iphigenia is 3 years old. Okay, and anyway, when it comes to the matter of the sacrifice, Agamemnon doesn't intend to sacrifice her. He loves her. Even though he suspects she may not be his daughter, he loves her. But they are set up for a fake sacrifice, a parallel to like Abraham and Isaac.
Right.
It's all they're going to at the last moment intervene and slaughter a deer as a sacrificial animal. Well, and Iphigenia, Iffy, it's just curious. She's a 3-year-old and she wants to hold the knife, and she asks, will this hurt? And they say, well, the knife is so sharp, you'll hardly feel a thing. And what is death? Is it like changing clothes? You change from one body to another? They'd say, sure. And she slits her throat, just on a whim and being playful and having no idea of the consequences. So anyway, so the same thing happens. She's dead, but it's very different in terms of the motivation and how people react to it and who's guilty of what. And I just have fun with that and do that kind of thing repeatedly in there. Okay.
I remember reading that scene, and it just resonated in so many ways with things that are happening in our world, the things that go on. I mean, I work with adolescents, and that's exactly what they do. Never mind being 3, try being 13 or 14. Young people have trouble with impulse control, or they're not seeing all the pieces, or let's see what happens if. Yeah. And it's not just kids either, So yeah. I think that is, I think that is the power of your narratives is how they can resonate in lots of different ways in our lives. And I have to believe that's what unites your current readers with ancient audiences, that if they weren't Trojan warriors here in the story, they could identify with the kinds of struggles that were playing out in these elaborate poems,
Right. Yeah.
So let me ask you, Richard, when did you mentioned being 10 years old and being exposed to the
Right.
Schliemann's discoveries. What launched your writing career? Have you been a full-time writer your entire life, or could you just kind of give us the context of you as a writer?
Well, I wrote my first story in the third grade, but and I discovered the Trojan War with Pope's translation of the Iliad way
Oh, wow.
back in the fifth grade, and that's an rhyming heroic couplets. It's absolutely
Mhm.
horrendous, but I loved it. I proceeded to try to write a sequel back in the fifth and sixth grade.
Oh, wow.
With rhymed couplets. Yeah, it was terrible, but it was great fun. Anyway, so I've always been. It's a disease you're born with. It is you decide to. It's who you are, and if I have four kids. I was married for 39 years. My wife died suddenly. That was 10 years ago. I now live in Milford, Connecticut, in a one-bedroom apartment with 4,000 books,
Oh,
and
boy.
I just read and write. One after the other, and it's a journey of discovery, and I have great fun at it.
Well, the fun definitely comes through your writing, and your definite understanding of your material. And you mentioned the sort of the fluidity piece of who these characters are, uh, and not afraid to disguise themselves. And I think some of the taboos that we culturally are trying to shake off now didn't exist in previous eons.
There is more fluidity in the world as I was perceiving it. There's several women in it who are tall, strong, Amazon-like. Cassandra, Andromache, the wife of Achilles, and at her wedding, after they have wedding games where people compete, she challenges the winner and whips him at wrestling. and, and then a little girl, a sister of Hector, Polyxena, asks her to please train her. She grows up to be very Amazon-like, and she learns well, and she eventually wrestles Achilles and out wrestles him. So we have some rather powerful women in this thing.
We do. And last year, and then a couple years back at Long Wharf down in New Haven, there was a production of an Iliad by Dennis O'Hare and Lisa Peterson. And it kind of speaks to the same kinds of things, because in both of in that play and the productions I've seen, women play returned Trojan warriors, talking about what a waste it was. And and basically they talk themselves in over the course of a couple hours in a one person performance through the trauma of war. And in both productions that I saw at Long Wharf as well as at Shakespeare and Company up in Massachusetts, the producers bring in contemporary references. So up in when Makania Chesser performed it at Shakespeare and Company, references to Ukraine. Down in New Haven, references to Iraq and Afghanistan. These are deliberate choices, and it's really, really powerful stuff. So are you inspired strictly by the epics, or are there other writers who have had an impact on you over the years in your collection of 4,000 books?
Okay. Well, among the novels that I've written recently, two of them are Shakespeare based. But my tastes are very eclectic. I read all of Shakespeare through twice as I was writing those. One of them was called Shakespeare's Twin Sister, which was great fun. And that one I used a bridge too. It was a different kind of a bridge. A 99-year-old woman in a nursing home wakes up one day with the soul of Shakespeare's twin sister and all of her memories. And she has a heck of a lot to say. And there's a reporter there taking it down, trying to figure what the hell is going on. But I had fun with that. There's one scene where it was set up in a way that neither of them knew that they had a twin, just by accident. I get like some 18th century novel or whatever. And they do eventually meet, and they actually fall in love, and that becomes a bit of an issue. But there's a book by Virginia Woolf called A Room of Her Own, where
Right.
she mentions the fact that if Shakespeare had had a sister, she would never have been able to do anything. Even she was more brilliant than him because she wouldn't have gotten an education, nobody would have paid any attention or whatever. So I was imagining, well, what if he did have a sister and it was a twin? And what if the guy who thought that he was her father had no son and treated her like a son and went out of his way to make sure she got an education, and to do that trained her to dress and act like a boy so that she could go to the school that was restricted just to boys. Okay. So she grows up that way. And even when she's an adult, she sometimes prefers to go out as a man. And on one of those occasions, when she's in Paris, she ends up having a sword fight with one of the king's musketeers and killing the captain of musketeers. But actually, and then later she and Will end up in London together, and they're able to do. By my version, it makes more sense in the historical version. The historical version, the reason people think that some people thought that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's plays is because it seemed absolutely impossible. Here was a man, he was writing one play while performing another. He was a full-time performer, having to rehearse the next play in the morning and perform the one they're doing now in the afternoon. And when the hell did he have time to write the next play? And when he wrote these plays, whatever remains, although we don't have copies of his handwritten versions, everyone who saw those copies was amazed that there were no corrections. This wasn't like autocorrect computers or anything. This is handwriting with a quill pen with no mistakes. How can he do this? But if he's got a twin and they're both great writers, then the one can be here and the other can be there. She can be a man or a woman, wherever she wants, as the occasion. Oh, and I had a fun scene there with Christopher Marlowe, who was competing with Shakespeare, and he was the most famous when Shakespeare was just getting started. Well, they collaborated in a few things, and when they're doing the collaboration, it's the sister who goes and collaborates, and Christopher Marlowe has a thing for her. Only Christopher Marlowe was gay. He thinks that she's a man. And when he finally makes a move on her and discovers that she's a woman, he really freaks out. He goes off, gets drunk, gets into a fight, and gets shot and killed.
Oh boy.
Anyway.
So it is so delightful to talk with you and hear about the adventures you have with your characters on the page and in your imagination. And it's tremendous fun. Yeah, it really is. And I'm hearing the problem solving, how Shakespeare could accomplish these things. And you do invite the reader to think, how could these problems be solved, or what was it like to be this particular person? I think in your most recent work, you poor Cassandra, it becomes understandable. I mean, she's such an empathetic character. When you read the Iliad, you want to understand and you want to know her story. And I just think your works are great additions to that literary conversation about what it means to be human, what it means to be alive in any age or time. I think you might have a twin tucked away somewhere too, Richard, given that you've written a couple dozen books and continuously working. You've got your most recent work coming out this fall. What's under construction now for you?
Well, actually, the thing I'll do almost simultaneously is I'm going to take excerpts from those 3 Trojan books and put them together like a series of novellas. And it'll be called Tales from Troy and Ithaca. And then I've got notes for one story I want to return to. I did a historical novel set in Russia, Ethiopia, and Manchuria around 1900.
Wow.
It was published back in 1981, and it was meant to be the beginning of a series of books, but I never got to it. And then a couple of years ago, I was about to return to it, and then the Ukrainian war broke out. Okay, and at first that inspired me to go back and start doing it. And then a friend of mine in the Ukraine that I was emailing with as the bombs were going over his head, he let me know that although Bulatovich was grew up in the Ukraine, he was considered by the Russians, by the Ukrainians, as being a Russian. And they're like totally canceling everything Russian. So whereas before there were monuments to Bulatovich in his hometown, and there was a club, all that got canceled. So I was backing off from that. I'm hoping the darn war ends and then I can go back and do that. Okay. There are stories to be told. He's a very unusual person. He was an explorer, and he was an officer of the guard in Petersburg who became an explorer in Ethiopia and later led cavalry in Manchuria when the Russians used the Boxer Rebellion as an excuse to conquer Manchuria. Then he became a monk and went to Mount Athos. And when he was there, he found himself at the center of a heresy dispute where Russia sent troops down and besieged the Russian monastery in Mount Athos, which is in Greece, and shipped off 880 monks to Siberia for believing that the name of God is part of God and therefore in itself divine. They were practicing the Jesus prayer, which is at the heart of Franny and Zoe by Salinger. That was the thing. For that, they were considered heretics. And Bulatovich was supporting them and pleading their case and everything. Before he could get the decision reversed, First World War breaks out. He volunteers as a chaplain at the front line. He wins badges, awards for leading troops into battle as a chaplain. You know, everybody's running away from the battlefield, and he somehow convinces them to turn around a bit anyway. And then eventually he was killed in his doorstep by unknown parties in the middle of the Russian Civil War, December 2, 1919. And I met his sister, okay, who was 97 years old when I met her, and who became the model for that character in the twins, Shakespeare's twin sister in the nursing home. She was very much that woman.
Oh, wow. So you are definitely attracted to very energetic characters for sure. How did she become the model for the Shakespeare story, though, the sister of this person who...
I managed to, on a shoestring, get a bus trip out to Penticton, British Columbia, which is where she was in a nursing home. And she was still a watercolor painter at 97. And she could play all of Chopin beautifully, but from memory. But her fingers were so arthritic, she couldn't open a piece of candy. But when she sat at the piano, the fingers could do what they needed to do. She had a wonderful memory. I recorded like 27 hours of interviews with her. And then I discovered, I found copies of books that this man, Alexander Bulatovich, had written about Ethiopia. I translated them from Russian to English. They were published. Like 10 years after the book was published, some obscure journal in Nairobi, Old Africa, devoted an entire issue to a review of the book. And the first line of it was, "This is the most important book about East Africa to have been published in the last 100 years.
Wow.
10 years after the book was published. Didn't sell any copies, but it made me feel really good. But Mary Orbeliani, she was a princess. She married a Georgian prince. There had been a local story about her, the Princess in Welfare. Okay, so it was easy for me to imagine when I was doing my Shakespeare book that here's this princess in a nursing home on welfare, and the nursing home calls a local paper to come and do a story about her because she's almost 100 years old, and when he's there, this has happened, and all of a sudden when he's interviewing her, she's talking about Shakespeare.
Oh, goodness.
Okay. So as easy to it's crazy, the twists of things. The family was Orbeliani. She married in the Orbeliani family. And just a few months ago, I got an email from a guy in Georgia, which is where the Orbeliani family were princes and princesses and such. And he was creating an archive of it. And I happen to have some things that her son, who is now long dead, he had written. He was an author. And I provided these things to them. And the next thing I knew, they were inviting me to come over to Georgia. I'm not about to go there as long as the Ukrainian war is going on. It's right in the backyard.
Right.
But that made me feel connected in an interesting way. Okay, anyway. You mentioned anything, I can go off on a tangent. Sorry.
No, those tangents are fascinating places. And that's what you were saying at the beginning of our conversations. The stories take you places.
Mhm.
And another tangent from me this time, it's so fascinating. I had a conversation with Connecticut's poet laureate, Antoinette Brimble, another vivacious, energetic writer who remarked that she writes her poems and her poems find where they need to go. And that was sort of coming back to mind and listening to you, that the stories find their authors, the poems find their authors, and then they find their audiences too. I think so much of what you're saying sounds to me like what you do is have faith in the story that's just asking to be told at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, that you show up for and put on the page. It is fascinating. It really is an amazing experience. And I want to go find all this other stuff that you're talking about, with this Vulatovich. I'm amazed, it's just.
It's called The Name of Hero. Yeah, is the name of the book.
The Name of Hero?
Yes, it's the first of what should have been a trilogy. I will return to it when the darn war ends.
And Richard, where can our listeners find The Name of Hero and the other texts
they're all at Amazon. Okay, the two ways to do that: you could go to Amazon and look for my name, and then or look for any of my books, like this We First Met in Ithaca or Breeze or whatever. Amazon has it. If you click on the author's name, it'll go to an author page, and then you'll see all of my stuff. The other thing you could do is go to my personal website, which is seltzerbooks.com. From there, you get links to everything, including links to a channel at YouTube where I've read many stories out loud and excerpts from some of my novels.
Do you have any readings scheduled with your upcoming book in the fall, or?
I am awful at promoting my work. Okay, I instead of marketing, I just write the next one.
Richard, would you read from one of your books for us now, just to make it part of our conversation?
I think that the best thing for me to do with that is a story from one of my books is called Together Tales. That's a collection of a bunch of people. The narrator is writing right after COVID, and he's writing about a cruise that he was on before COVID. And people on cruises, they get together at dinner time, whatever, and this set of 8 people share stories every night. And this is one of the stories that's told. Many of them are kind of romantic. Anyway, it's called The Princess Tango, and it's on a princess cruise. Alex and Laurel got engaged before their first date. His best friend and her best friend got married. They were both in the wedding party. He gave her a ride home. She invited him in. He proposed immediately, and she accepted without hesitation. They went on a Caribbean cruise for their honeymoon on the princess ship that was the set for the Love Boat series. They were deliriously happy together. Neither of them had danced much before the cruise, but they wound up going to free dance lessons in the afternoon and then dancing from dinner to midnight every night. The dance instructor and his wife were Chinese. He claimed that he had taught finance at Harvard Business School and that this was his retirement, cruising the world with his wife, who was his dance partner, and passing on to others these steps that for them had led to marital harmony and bliss. Happy wife, happy life, he said proudly. He was rigid in his teaching style. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is how it is done in the cha-cha. This is how it is done in the merengue. This is how it is done in the tango. This is the way. This is the sequence of moves and steps and no other. If you and your partner each learn that and do that, you will be in sync with one another and will experience the joy of dance and the joy of marital harmony. At first, Alex and Laurel rigidly followed his instructions, but they soon found that their bodies moved together naturally, even when they forgot the instructions, even when they unintentionally used a cha-cha move and a foxtrot, even when they mimicked other experienced dancers and added unorthodox side steps and hand-over-hand twirls. By day 4, they stopped going to the lessons, but still danced until midnight. and their repertoire expanded. They felt the music in their bodies, and they anticipated one another's moves with no effort at all. Soon their dancing evolved to a set of moves that they could, with minor modifications, use to any music from waltz to tango. There was one routine they chanced upon that they hadn't seen anyone else do. 1, 2 to the left, overhead twirl with hand holding, twirl back again, side left, side right, then walk straight ahead with arms joined behind their backs. They were proud of that move and did it smoothly. Other couples would stop and watch when they did it, and they would try to imitate it. That cruise, that magical moment, ended all too soon. They flew back to Philadelphia, picked up their car at the airport, and drove toward their home in Huntington Valley. It was a clear moonlit night in June. They were holding hands and listening to a radio station playing the Tennessee Waltz, which they had danced to as the ship sailed away from St. Martin when a tractor trailer coming toward them on the other side of the road lost control and jackknifed into them. When Alex woke up in the hospital, he was told that Laurel had died in the crash. At first, in his confusion, he didn't know who Laurel was. His parents and his sister helped fill in the gaps in his memory, but he couldn't help but feel that he was dreaming now, that this was a nightmare that he would wake up from, and that he had dreamt meeting Laurel and falling in love with her, and had dreamt their cruise ship honeymoon. Nothing felt real, not the past, not the present. Eventually, he went on with his life. He married again. They had 2 kids. They divorced. He married again and had another kid and divorced. His memories of Laurel and their time together faded. When he retired, 40 years after the accident, he treated himself to a Caribbean cruise alone. Retirement was a downer. Living alone was a downer. His kids were grown and married with kids of their own and were scattered, living hundreds of miles from Philadelphia. He saw them once, sometimes twice a year. And aside from his kids, he had little to look back on with pride and nothing to look forward to. The routine of going to work and doing what was expected of him was over. He was no longer part of the work-related web of expectation, recognition, and camaraderie. When he jogged or used a treadmill at the gym, as his doctor recommended, he couldn't help but feel that all the activity of his life has been like this, going in circles or going nowhere, accomplishing nothing that would last. When he died, aside from his kids, he would have left nothing behind, no sign of his existence. He might just as well have never lived. Going down to dinner on day 2 of the cruise, as they were sailing away from Princess Cay in the Bahamas, a band on the piazza was playing the Tennessee Waltz, and a dozen couples were dancing. He overheard 2 couples talking about an unusual dance move that one couple had done on day 1 and nearly all the experienced dancers had picked up. It resembled a tango move, but they used it in the cha-cha, the merengue, and even the waltz, like now. They called it the tango step, the princess tango step. There was a legend that had been passed down through the years about a young couple on their honeymoon who had first done it and done it so well that others copied it, and others copied them. People called it a meme, a piece of human culture that perpetuates itself, an echo of that time long ago and of the love of that couple who first danced it. As if the love of 2 people in harmony with one another found natural expression in these very moves. And as long as there was love in the world, there would be the Princess Tango.
Oh, wow.
I can't read that without my eyes tearing up. I'm sorry.
Oh my God, I was on the edge of my seat. How's this gonna go? This poor guy.
I actually did come across a couple on a cruise who he proposed the day that they met, you know.
The compelling nature of that narrative is just what your other texts have in common. It's just really, really gripping. So thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for your time this morning, Richard. That was amazing.
Well, thank you. It's been fun. Okay.